What happens when a Boston lady with a secret that could get her killed is the sole survivor of a massacre in the Arizona desert? What happens when her only protector is a silent Apache warrior, a man haunted by ghosts she cannot see? This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of two worlds colliding under the unforgiving sun, a tale of a promised vengeance and a whispered plea in the dead of night. They called the West a land of opportunity, but for Eliza May Thompson, it was a land of predators, and her only hope was the one man the world saw as a savage. Stay with us as we unravel the story of the silent warrior and the virgin he swore to protect. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Arizona territory, beating down on the splintered remains of the Butterfield Overland stagecoach. It lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its wheels pointing accusingly at a sky the color of bleached bone. The bodies of the driver, the shotgun guard, and two drummers from Philadelphia were already beginning to bloat in the oppressive heat, their lifeblood staining the ochre dust, a dark, ugly crimson. Hidden in a shallow ravine, shielded by a cluster of sun-scorched creosote bushes, Eliza May Thompson held a hand over her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to tear from her raw throat. The fine silk of her Boston traveling dress was ripped and sullied with dirt and blood, not her own, thankfully, but the spray from the man who had been sitting beside her. She had watched him die, his eyes wide, with a final shocked disbelief. They had been animals. The bandits, led by a man with a cruel, sneering face and a scar that twisted his lip into a permanent grimace, had not been interested in the mail or the passenger's coin nearly as much as they were in her. "Blackwood sends his regards, Miss Thompson." The leader had rasped his breath, smelling of cheap whiskey and malice. "He wants his property returned." Property. That's what Jedediah Blackwood considered her. His promised bride. The key to unlocking her father's shipping fortune. But Eliza had seen the devil behind Jedediah's polished smile. She had seen him in the dim light of his study beat a man to death over a disputed land deed. She hadn't just fled a marriage, she had fled a murderer, and he had sent his wolves to drag her back. She had escaped during the chaos, scrambling away as the bandits argued over her fate, whether to deliver her back, bruised or broken. Now she was alone. The silence that followed the thunder of gunshots and the jeers of wicked men was somehow more terrifying. It was a silence filled with the hum of insects, the distant cry of a hawk, and the frantic pounding of her own heart. Hours bled into one another. Thirst became a physical torment, her tongue a swollen, useless thing in her mouth. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fire and blood. Despair, cold and heavy, was beginning to settle over her when a shadow fell across the ravine. Eliza froze her blue eyes, widening in terror. She pressed herself flatter against the earth, praying for invisibility. A pair of moccasin-clad feet stopped just inches from her hiding place. They were worn, sturdy, and silent. Her eyes traveled slowly upward, past leather-bound leggings, a breechcloth, and a chest crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. His skin was the color of rich copper, his shoulders broad and powerful. He held a simple, unadorned bow in one hand. His face was a mask of hard angles and stoic indifference, framed by a cascade of straight jet-black hair. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, deep-set, and held a sorrow so profound it seemed to absorb the light around them. He was Apache. Fear, primal and sharp, lanced through her. She had heard stories in the East, lurid tales of savages who knew no mercy. But as he watched her, there was no threat in his gaze. There was nothing. just a deep, unnerving stillness. He had seen the carnage, he had followed the tracks, and now he had found the only thing left alive. He knelt, his movements fluid and economical. He reached out not toward her, but to a small leather canteen at his hip. He uncorked it and held it out. The gesture was simple, unambiguous. An offering. Eliza stared at the canteen, then back at his impassive face. Her thirst was a raging inferno overriding her fear. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. The water was warm, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, then stopped remembering her manners and tried to hand it back. He simply gestured for her to drink more. When she was finished, he stood and looked back the way she had come then, toward the distant, hazy mountains. He knew she couldn't stay here. The desert and the men who hunted her would claim her by morning. He looked back down at her, at the fine, useless dress, the pale, terrified face, the delicate hands, unsuited for this brutal land. He saw not a woman, but a broken dove, its wing shattered, left to the mercy of coyotes. His people had a word, Indy. It meant the people. It was a word of connection, of responsibility. His own Indy were scattered, lost to the relentless tide of the white man's world. His wife and son were gone, victims of a sickness that followed the soldiers. He was a ghost, a man with no tribe, no family, bound only by the memories that haunted his silence. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story, but he saw the same shadow of the predator in her eyes that he saw in the eyes of a cornered fawn. And in that moment, something shifted within the silent emptiness of his soul. He would not leave her. He pointed to himself and spoke a single word, his voice, a low, gravelly sound, unused and rough. Kyle. Then he pointed to the mountains, a clear destination. He turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if she followed. The choice was hers. Stay and die, or follow the silent Apache into the unknown. Eliza May Thompson, daughter of Boston's elite, pushed herself to her feet. Her legs shook, her body ached, but as she watched the warrior's back straight and resolute against the setting sun, she knew there was no choice at all. She took a breath, gathered the tattered remnants of her courage, and followed him into the growing darkness. The man named Cale had made a silent vow. He did not know her, but he would protect her with his life. It was the first purpose he'd had in a very long time. The first 3 days were a waking nightmare for Eliza. The world she had known of cushioned settees, polite conversation, and predictable seasons had been stripped away, replaced by a brutal reality of rock and thorn. Her fine leather shoes, designed for cobblestone streets, were shredded within the first day. The merciless terrain cut into her soft feet, and every step became a study in pain. Kyle was a creature of this land. He moved through it, not with force, but with a kind of quiet harmony. He found water where Eliza saw only cracked earth, pulling moisture from the roots of a pale, ugly-looking plant. He identified the tracks of a rattlesnake and guided her around its unseen hiding place. He moved with a silence that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He was a phantom, and she was a clattering, clumsy burden. He never spoke. After telling her his name, a wall of silence had descended once more. Communication was a language of gestures. A hand held up meant, "Stop." A point to the sky meant, "Rain coming, find shelter." A finger to his lips as he crouched low meant danger. On the second day, he presented her with a pair of moccasins. He had worked on them the night before by the small, smokeless fire he'd built, using a piece of buck skin from his pack and sinew to stitch them together. They were rough, but when Eliza slipped her blistered feet into them, the relief was so profound she almost wept. He looked away, his face, unreadable, as if embarrassed by her gratitude. Eliza learned that his silence was not one of emptiness, but of observation. He noticed everything, the way a lizard scurried for cover, the change in the wind's direction, the faint plume of dust miles to the east, the dust of their pursuers. He taught her without words. He would pause and touch a plant, then crush its leaves and rub them on his skin. Eliza, mimicking him, found the pungent aroma kept the biting flies at bay. He showed her how to walk on the balls of her feet to minimize noise and conserve energy. Slowly she began to adapt. The pampered Bostonian was being burned away by the desert sun, leaving behind a tougher, more resilient core. She learned to drink sparingly, to read the signs of exhaustion in her own body, and to trust the silent man who led her. One night, huddled in a shallow cave, as a cold wind whipped through the canyon, she watched him stare into the flames. The firelight danced across the harsh planes of his face, and for the first time, she saw the deep-seated pain in his eyes. They were not the eyes of a savage, but of a man who had lost everything. "Kyle," she said, her voice soft. He didn't turn, but his posture stiffened slightly, acknowledging her. "Thank you," she whispered, for everything." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Eliza felt a desperate urge to connect, to break through his wall of solitude. "Where are we going?" she asked. He finally turned his head, his dark gaze meeting hers. He lifted a hand and pointed north toward a series of jagged, tooth-like peaks on the horizon. "Sierra Ancha." He said the two words, a heavy weight in the air. The White Mountains, a place of refuge, a place he once called home. The next day, the dust cloud to the east was closer. Kyle's pace quickened. He led them into a labyrinth of narrow slot canyons, the red rock walls soaring hundreds of feet on either side, so close in places that they had to walk single file. The air grew cooler, the sunlight a mere ribbon of gold far above. It was here that the echoes began. Not of sound, but of the past. As they rested in the shade, Eliza saw Cale trace a faint pictograph on the canyon wall, a spiral, a symbol of the journey of life. His fingers lingered on the faded red ochre, and a flicker of deep emotion crossed his face before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. He was remembering. This was his land, the land of his ancestors, a land now being carved up, sold off and hunted by men like Jedediah Blackwood. Far behind them, Silas Kane, the man Blackwood had hired, knelt and examined the tracks. He was not like the brutes from the stagecoach attack. Kane was a tracker of renown, a patient and intelligent predator. He was slender, almost dapper in his dress, with a silver-plated Colt peacemaker at his hip. He was known as Silver Tongue for his ability to charm and deceive, but his true gift was in the hunt. "He's Apache," Kane said to the two hired guns with him. "See here the way he places his feet, using the rock, leaving almost no sign, and the woman's tracks. Her stride is longer now. He's teaching her." "Let's just ride 'em down, Kane," one of the men, a hulking brute named Pike, grumbled. Silas Kane smiled a thin, cold expression. "Patience, Pike. Blackwood wants the girl alive. The Apache, he wants him dead. To do that, we must understand him. He is heading for the high country, for the rough places. He thinks he can lose us in the canyons." Kane stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. "But an Apache always has a place he calls home, a place he runs to when he is wounded. And that is where we will find him." Unaware of the chillingly accurate prediction, Eliza felt a strange sense of peace in the canyons. The towering walls provided a feeling of security. She and Cale were a world unto themselves, the only two people in existence. The bond between them was deepening, forged not in conversation, but in shared hardship, in the simple act of one person keeping the other alive. That evening, as Cale prepared a snare to catch a rabbit, Eliza took the first watch. Sitting on a rock, holding the old heavy rifle he had given her from his pack, she felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer just Eliza May Thompson, the fleeing debutante. She was a survivor, and the silent, haunted man who had saved her was becoming more than just a guide. He was becoming her entire world. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She looked over at him, his profile stark against the twilight, and understood that her journey was no longer just about escaping Jedediah Blackwood. It was about discovering who she was meant to be here in the heart of this wild, beautiful, and dangerous land. After a week in the wilderness, they saw the town. It wasn't much, just a handful of clapboard buildings shimmering in the heat haze, huddled around a dusty track that served as the main street. A faded sign read, "Redemption Gulch." For Eliza, it was a vision of paradise. A real bed, a hot meal, a moment's respite from the constant threat of the wild. Kyle was less enthusiastic. He stood on the ridge overlooking the settlement, his body tense, his eyes narrowed. To him, these places were wounds on the land, filled with a different kind of predator men, whose greed and hatred were more dangerous than any mountain lion. But their supplies were low. Eliza was gaunt, her dress hanging off her in rags. They needed food, and she needed clothes that wouldn't mark her as an outsider. He gave her a small pouch of coins. "Get dress. Food, no talk," he commanded in his clipped, sparse English. "Wait at livery. Sundown." He would not go in with her. An Apache walking into a town like Redemption Gulch was an invitation for trouble. He would watch from the hills, a silent guardian. Eliza walked into town, feeling as if she had stepped onto a different planet. The stares she received were immediate and hostile. A lone woman, her face smudged with dirt, her hair a wild tangle, her fine dress in tatters, she was an object of scorn and suspicion. She kept her head down, clutching the coins, and made her way to the general store. The proprietor, a balding man with suspicious eyes, sold her a simple calico dress, a sturdy pair of boots, and some dried rations without a word. As she was leaving, a voice, smooth as warmed honey, stopped her. "Mum, you look like you've had a rough time of it. Can I offer you a drink? Some water, perhaps?" She turned. The man leaning against the doorway was handsome in a polished, predatory way. He was well-dressed, a stark contrast to the rough miners and cowboys in the street. A silver-plated revolver rested on his hip. It was Silas Kane. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't recognize him, but instinct screamed at her. This man was dangerous. "No, thank you. I'm fine," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. Kane's smile widened. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes and savored it. "A lady of quality, I can tell, despite your current circumstances. It's a dangerous world out here for a woman alone. My name is Silas Kane. I'm a traveler myself. I'm not alone," she said the words, slipping out before she could stop them. "Oh." Kane's eyes glinted with interest. He had found her. The Apache must be near. "Then your companion is a lucky man, but a careless one to leave such a treasure unattended." Every nerve in Eliza's body screamed run. "I have to go." She hurried away, her mind racing. He knew. He had to be one of Blackwood's men. She didn't dare look back. She bought the food, her hands shaking, then made her way to the livery stable at the edge of town, the agreed-upon meeting place. The sun was low, painting the street in long, ominous shadows. Inside the livery, the air was thick with the smell of hay and manure. She waited in the growing gloom, her anxiety a living thing. Had Kyle seen the man? Did he know minutes stretched into an eternity? Just as true panic began to set in, a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow in the corner of the stable. It was Kyle. He had been there the whole time, watching. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the back door of the livery. He had seen Silas Kane. He had watched the entire exchange from a hiding spot on a nearby roof. He knew the hunter had found their trail. As they slipped out the back and into the twilight, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the main street. Kane and his men were organizing a search party, fanning out from the town. They had lost precious time. They moved through the night, Kyle pushing them at a relentless pace. The brief hope Eliza had felt in Redemption Gulch had curdled into fear. There was no safety, no respite. The serpent was no longer just a distant threat. It was in their midst, and it had a silver tongue. "The man," she panted as they paused for a moment behind a rock outcropping. "In the town. I see." Kyle set his voice a low growl. The single phrase was filled with a cold fury. He was angry not at her, but at himself. He had been careless. He had underestimated the reach of the man who hunted her. This was no common bounty hunter. This was a professional. They traveled for 2 more days, climbing higher into the rugged foothills of the Sierra Ancha. The terrain grew more difficult, a chaotic jumble of jagged rocks and steep ravines. Kyle was a ghost, leaving almost no trace, but he knew Kane was good. He would not be shaken easily. The pursuit had become personal. For Kane, it was a matter of professional pride. For Kyle, it was the defense of the last flicker of purpose in his life. For Eliza, it was the chilling realization that the civilized world, with its charming smiles and smooth words, was far more dangerous than the silent wilderness she had come to embrace. Redemption. Gulch had offered no redemption, only the certainty that the hunt was far from over. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. The higher they climbed into the Sierra Ancha, the more the landscape changed. The oppressive heat of the low desert gave way to the cool, pine-scented air of the high country. Ponderosa pines stood like ancient sentinels on the slopes, and the silence was broken only by the whisper of the wind through their needles. This was Kyle's land. He moved with a new confidence, a sense of belonging that Eliza had not seen in him before. But the relentless pursuit had taken its toll. They were both exhausted, running on reserves of fear and adrenaline. Kane was always there, a persistent shadow they could never quite shake. One evening, they found shelter in a hidden alcove behind a waterfall, the curtain of water masking their scent and the smoke from their small fire. The roar of the water created a bubble of isolation, a temporary sanctuary from the world. Eliza was tending to a deep gash on Kyle's arm, sustained when he'd slipped on a rock face while helping her across. She carefully cleaned the wound with water and a strip of cloth from her old dress. Her touch was gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Kyle sat unnaturally still, watching her. His silence was different tonight, not stoic, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "It will need to be stitched," she said softly, looking at the torn flesh. He simply nodded his gaze, unwavering. She took a needle and some sinew thread from his pouch, her hands steady despite the grim task. As she worked, drawing the edges of the wound together with neat, small stitches learned from her grandmother's needlepoint lessons, the intimacy of the moment was palpable. When she finished, she looked up and found him still watching her. His eyes filled with a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. "Why?" he finally said, his voice raspy. "Why they hunt you?" The question hung in the air, suspended in the mist from the waterfall. Eliza had kept her secret locked away, a poison she held alone. But here, in this hidden place, with this man who had saved her life countless times, the truth felt less like a burden and more like a story that needed to be told. She took a deep breath. The man who sent them, his name is Jedediah Blackwood. My father arranged for me to marry him. He is wealthy, powerful, respected in Boston. She looked down at her hands. But he is a monster. He doesn't love me. He wants my father's company. He wants me. Like a possession. A beautiful horse to add to his stable. Kyle's expression remained unchanged, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. I refused. She continued, her voice gaining strength. I told my father I wouldn't do it. There was a terrible argument. That night, I went to Mr. Blackwood's study to tell him myself, to plead with him. But there was another man there. His name was Arthur Abernathy. He was Mr. Blackwood's partner in a land venture out here in this territory. She paused, the memory vivid and horrifying. They were arguing. Mr. Abernathy was accusing Blackwood of cheating the railroad, of faking deeds. He said he was going to expose him. He wanted out of the partnership. Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. Blackwood. He just smiled. Then he picked up a heavy crystal decanter from his desk and he hit Mr. Abernathy, over and over. I was hidden behind a curtain. I saw everything. The blood, the sound. I will never forget it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. I ran. I took what money I could, and I bought a ticket west to California. I thought I could disappear. But he found out. The men at the stagecoach, they weren't just sent to bring me back. They were sent to silence a witness. She finally looked at Kyle, her soul bare. So now you know. I am not just a runaway bride. I am a witness to a murder. And he will never, ever stop hunting me. The silence that followed was profound. Kyle stared into the fire, his mind processing her words. The name Abernathy stirred a faint, distant memory. A white man who had traded fairly with his people years ago. A man who respected their boundaries. He finally looked at her, and the sorrow in his eyes was now mingled with a cold, hard resolve. His fight to protect her was no longer just an act of instinct or a quest for personal redemption. It now had a name and a face. Jedediah Blackwood, a man who killed for land, a man who stole and murdered to feed his greed. He was the same kind of man who had brought the sickness to Cale's village, the same kind of man who had driven his people from their ancestral homes. He was the serpent that had poisoned the entire world. Kyle reached out, and with a startlingly gentle touch, his thumb brushed away a stray tear from her cheek. My wife, he said the words costing him a visible effort. My son. Sickness from the soldiers fought. They protect a man who wanted the river water for his cattle. He paid the soldiers to move my people. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of a shattered world. The name of this man was Blackwood. Eliza stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. The world which had seemed so vast and chaotic suddenly snapped into a terrifyingly small focus. It wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. A dark, twisted thread that had bound their lives together long before they ever met. Jedediah Blackwood had not just destroyed her future. He had annihilated Cale's past. The whispers on the wind now carried a new message. This was no longer a flight for survival. It had become a journey toward a reckoning. They were not just the hunted anymore. They were the avengers, and the waterfall that shielded them seemed to roar with the promise of a coming storm. The knowledge of their shared enemy settled between them a grim and unbreakable bond. Kyle was no longer just protecting Eliza. He was seeking a justice he thought long dead. He knew Blackwood's man Cain would not give up. The hunt would only intensify. So Kyle chose the ground for their stand, a treacherous maze of canyons and spire-like rock formations, known to the local tribes as the Devil's Anvil. It was a place where a man who knew the land could fight 10 who did not. He led Eliza on a grueling 2-day journey, deliberately leaving a trail that was easy enough for a master tracker like Cain to follow. It was a calculated risk, a baited trap. "He will follow," Kyle stated, as they looked down from a high ledge into the labyrinth below. "He is proud. He thinks we run." "And we're not running," Eliza asked her hand, clutching the rifle he had taught her to load and fire. Kyle looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a grim, dangerous expression. "No, we wait." They prepared their battlefield. Kyle showed Eliza how to build a false campfire near a cliff edge to draw their attention. He positioned her in a narrow crevice high on a canyon wall, a perfect sniper's nest, with a clear view of the trail below. "You shoot only when I say," he instructed, his hands briefly clasping her shoulders. "Do not be seen." The waiting was the hardest part. As the sun beat down on the red rocks, Eliza's mind raced. The woman who had fainted at the sight of a mouse in Boston was now preparing for a gunfight. She was terrified, but a cold resolve had settled in her heart. She was done being the victim. Late in the afternoon they appeared, 3 figures on horseback, picking their way carefully through the canyon. Silas Cain was in the lead, his confident posture unmistakable even from a distance. Cain reined in his horse, looking at the tracks. "They're getting tired," he called back to Pike and the other man, Jeb. "Sloppy, there's a fire up ahead. We'll have them before nightfall." They dismounted and proceeded on foot, moving toward the decoy campfire. This was Kyle's design. On foot, they were vulnerable, stripped of their horses' speed and height advantage. Kyle melted into the rocks, becoming one with the shadows. He moved with a supernatural silence, circling around behind them. Cain and his men crept toward the fire rifles raised. "Come on out, Miss Thompson," Cain called, his voice echoing eerily off the canyon walls. "Let's end this civilized like Mr. Blackwood is a forgiving man." The fire crackled, but there was no other reply. A sense of unease began to creep into Cain. This was too easy. He signaled for Pike to circle around the rocks. That's when the first arrow struck. It made no sound, but a soft thwip as it embedded itself deep in Jeb's throat. The man gasped, dropping his rifle, and clawed at the shaft before collapsing in a heap. "Ambush!" Cain yelled, diving for cover behind a boulder. Pike opened fire blindly into the rocks, where he thought the shot had come from the rifle's roar, a deafening explosion in the canyon. Eliza's heart was in her throat. Her hands were slick with sweat on the stock of the rifle. She saw Cain peering from behind his rock, trying to pinpoint Cale's position. "Now," came a low whisper. It was Kyle. He had circled back and was positioned in the rocks just below her perch. Eliza took a breath, steadied her aim as he had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder. The shot was not perfect. It missed Cain, but it splintered the rock just beside his head, showering him with sharp fragments. He cried out in pain and surprise, momentarily blinded. The shot had come from a completely different direction than he expected. Pike, confused, turned toward the source of the rifle shot, exposing his back. It was all the opening Kyle needed. He launched himself from the rocks, a silent, avenging spirit. He was not a man fighting with a gun. He was a warrior. He wielded a heavy stone war club, a weapon of brutal close-quarters combat. Pike turned his eyes wide with shock, but he was too slow. Kyle was on him, the club a blur of motion. The fight was short, savage, and decisive. Now only Cain remained. He was pinned down his cheek, bleeding from the rock splinters. He was a hunter, but he had been out-hunted. He fired his silver-plated Colt wildly, the bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls. Kyle used the echoes to his advantage, moving under the cover of the noise. Cain was panicking, firing at shadows. Eliza reloaded her hands, working with a newfound efficiency. She had him in her sights again. "No," Kyle's voice commanded from below. "He is mine." Silas Cain ran out of bullets. The sudden ringing silence was terrifying. He fumbled for more cartridges, his hands shaking. Kyle stepped out from behind a rock formation, not 10 yards from him. He held no weapon, his hands empty at his sides. "Damn you, you savage!" Cain snarled, trying to reload his pistol. Kyle simply walked toward him. There was no rage on his face, only a profound and chilling emptiness. He was death itself walking on 2 legs. Cain finally managed to slot a cartridge in and snapped the chamber shut. He raised the pistol, his hand trembling. At that moment, Eliza screamed, "No!" The sound distracted Cain for a fraction of a second. He glanced up toward her perch. In that instant, Kyle closed the distance. He didn't disarm Cain. He simply grabbed the man's wrist, turning the gun back toward its owner. He forced Cain's own finger to pull the trigger. The shot was deafening. Silas Cain's eyes went wide, a look of utter astonishment on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Silence returned to the devil's anvil. It was over. Eliza scrambled down from her perch, her legs weak. She looked at the bodies, at the blood seeping into the thirsty red dust. The brutality of it all washed over her, and she felt a wave of nausea. Kyle stood over Cain's body, his chest heaving. He looked at his hands, then at Eliza. He had not only protected her, he had allowed vengeance for his people to turn him back into the killer he thought he had left behind. Eliza walked toward him, her fear replaced by a deep, aching empathy. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the horror at his own capacity for violence. She did not recoil from him. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. It was steady and warm. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You saved me." He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes. The chasm between their 2 worlds seemed for the first time bridgeable. They had survived the reckoning at Devil's Anvil, but in doing so, they had both been irrevocably changed. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were partners bound by blood and a shared destiny. The violence at Devil's Anvil left a scar on both of them. Kyle became even more withdrawn, the ghost of the warrior he had been reawakened, and now warring with the quiet man he had become. Eliza, though she had played her part, was haunted by the image of Silas Cain's surprised face in the moment of his death. They were alive, but their pursuers were gone, and the sudden silence left too much room for thought. Kyle led them away from that place of death, deeper into the heart of the Sierra Ancha. He took them to a place he had not seen since he was a boy, a hidden valley protected on all sides by sheer cliffs, accessible only through a narrow, concealed passage. Inside it was a different world. A clear, spring-fed stream trickled through a meadow of wildflowers. Ancient cottonwood trees provided ample shade, and the air was sweet and still. It was a sanctum, a place untouched by the stained hands of the outside world. For several days they did not travel. They rested. They healed. The physical wounds were the easiest to mend. The cut on Kyle's arm began to close, and the bruises and scratches on Eliza's body started to fade. The wounds of the soul were another matter. They fell into a quiet domesticity. Eliza would wash their clothes in the stream while Kyle hunted or foraged. They would eat their meals in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the pristine night sky. The frantic pace of their flight was replaced by a slow, gentle rhythm. One afternoon, Eliza found Kyle standing by the stream, staring into the water. His reflection stared back, a stoic mask that could not quite hide the turmoil within. "Does this place have a name?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. He was silent for a long time. "My people called it Iswangolisi," he said, his pronunciation soft and guttural. "The place of healing." He looked at her. "I brought my son here once, to teach him the names of the stars." It was the most he had ever offered about his family. Eliza's heart ached for him. "He would be proud of you, Coyle," she said. A single bitter tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. "I killed those men. Like an animal." "You did what you had to do," she insisted, her voice fierce with conviction. "They would have killed us. They were the animals, Cale, not you." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching hers, desperate for absolution. "In my heart, there is much anger. Blackwood, he took everything. Now you." He struggled for the words. "He wants to take you. I see my wife's face when I look at you. I see what was stolen." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Eliza finally understood the depths of his vow to protect her. It was not just about her. It was about reclaiming a piece of his stolen honor, about defending the memory of his lost love. She reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I am not her Kyle," she whispered. "But I see you. I see the good man you are. The man who saved me." The physical barrier between them dissolved. He leaned in his forehead, resting against hers. They stood like that for a long time, breathing the same air, their shared pain and survival, a palpable force. The world shrank to this single point of contact, this quiet understanding. That night the air was cool. They sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. The tension that had defined their journey had been replaced by a new, more profound connection. It was an intimacy born not of flirtation or courtship, but of shared blood, shared fear, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's brokenness. Kyle looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair, and the strength that now resided in her blue eyes. She was no longer the fragile dove he had found in the ravine. She was a woman forged in the fires of the desert, strong and resilient. And beautiful. He reached across the small space separating them and took her hand. His touch was hesitant, questioning. Eliza did not pull away. She intertwined her fingers with his, a simple gesture that conveyed a world of acceptance. He led her away from the fire, into the soft darkness beneath the cottonwood trees. There was no need for words. Their journey had been a long, brutal conversation, and this was its inevitable conclusion. He gently kissed her, a touch as soft as a moth's wing, full of a pain and a longing that stole her breath. She returned the kiss, putting all of her fear, her gratitude, and her burgeoning love into the act. This was right. This was the only thing that made sense in a world gone mad. As he began to unlace the simple calico dress, she stopped his hands. He pulled back, his eyes clouded with concern, afraid he had misread everything. But she only smiled, a sad, sweet smile. She took his hand and placed it over her heart, letting him feel its steady beat. "I am a virgin, Ghostlow," she whispered to the silent Apache, who swore to protect her with his life. Her whisper was not one of fear, but of trust. It was the ultimate act of surrender, the giving of the last piece of the old Eliza to this man who had shown her who she was meant to be. It was a plea for tenderness in a world that had only shown them brutality. And Kyle, the man who had lost everything, understood. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, a fragile flame he had to protect from the wind. In the place of healing, under the silent watch of his ancestors' stars, two broken souls came together, not to forget their scars, but to begin healing them together. Their time in the hidden valley was a stolen breath, a moment of peace in a life of turmoil. But both Cale and Eliza knew it couldn't last. Hiding was not a solution. It was a postponement of the inevitable. Jedediah Blackwood was still out there. His power, his money, and his obsessive need for control would not vanish simply because his hired guns were dead. "He will send more men," Kyle said one morning, as they watched the sunrise paint the cliffs in shades of rose and gold. "He will not stop." "Then we can't keep running," Eliza replied, her voice steady. The woman who had once planned to disappear in California was gone. "Running is what he expects. I am the only person who saw what he did. My testimony is the only thing that can stop him." A new plan began to form, a dangerous and audacious one. They would not run from Blackwood. They would go to him, not for a confrontation of violence, but one of justice. The nearest major town with a federal marshal was Prescott, the territorial capital. It was a long and dangerous ride, but it was their only chance. The journey to Prescott was different from their desperate flight. They were no longer the hunted, but the hunters, carrying a truth as deadly as any weapon. They acquired horses and supplies from a small, remote trading post, paying with the last of Eliza's money and the silver from Silas Kane's colt. As they drew closer to Prescott, the landscape became more populated. Ranches and small homesteads dotted the valleys. This was the world Blackwood sought to control. They learned from a talkative blacksmith that Jedediah Blackwood himself was in the territory, overseeing the expansion of his empire from a lavish, newly built ranch just outside of town. He was presenting himself as a pillar of the community, a bringer of progress and civilization. The news settled like a stone in their stomachs. Confronting him would be more dangerous than they had ever imagined. He wasn't some distant villain. He was here surrounded by his wealth and his paid-off men, including most likely the local sheriff. They arrived in Prescott at dusk, two weathered and anonymous figures on horseback. They found a room in a small boarding house, and Kyle immediately went to scout the town, his instincts on high alert. Eliza, meanwhile, did the unthinkable. She wrote a letter to the territorial marshal, John Les Fremont, detailing everything she knew, the murder of Arthur Abernathy, the land fraud, and the attempts on her life. She named Silas Kane and described the attack on the stagecoach. It was her word against a powerful man's, but it was all she had. She arranged for a young stable boy to deliver it, a fail-safe, in case they did not survive what was to come. Kyle returned with grim news. Blackwood's ranch was a fortress, and the town sheriff, a man named Marcus Thorne, was a frequent guest there. They could not expect help from the law in Prescott. "Then we draw the snake from its hole," Eliza said, a cold fire in her eyes. The next day she walked into the Grand Hotel, where Blackwood was known to take his midday meal. She was dressed in a simple but clean dress, her hair neatly combed. She looked less like a fugitive and more like a determined, respectable woman. The whispers started immediately as she took a seat alone at a table. It didn't take long. Jedediah Blackwood entered, flanked by two armed men. He was exactly as she remembered, impeccably dressed, handsome, with eyes as cold and dead as a shark's. When he saw her, his face registered a moment of pure shock, which was quickly replaced by a possessive, triumphant smile. "Eliza, my dear," he said, approaching her table, his voice a low purr that made her skin crawl. "What a surprise. I have been worried sick." "I am sure you have, Jedediah," she replied, her voice clear and strong, drawing the attention of everyone in the dining room. "You must have been terrified that I might tell someone what I saw in your study that night." The color drained from Blackwood's face. His smile vanished. "You are hysterical, my dear. The journey has clearly addled you. Has it, or did it addle your partner, Mr. Abernathy, when you crushed his skull with a decanter?" Gasps rippled through the room. Blackwood's eyes blazed with fury. "Sheriff Thorne," he bellowed, "arrest this woman. She is clearly insane." Sheriff Thorne, who had been sitting at a nearby table, rose to his feet, his face flushed. But before he could move, the front doors of the hotel swung open. Kyle stood there, framed in the doorway. He was not dressed for hiding. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, his chest bare, his long hair unbound. In his hand he held not a gun, but the bow of his people. He was a spectre of the wild, an accusation in human form, a living embodiment of the land Blackwood sought to tame and bleed dry. Blackwood's men drew their guns. "Shoot him! Shoot the savage!" Blackwood shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "He is with me," Eliza cried, standing up. "And his people are the ones you displaced to steal your river water. Jedediah, the ones whose land you bought with Arthur Abernathy's blood." The scene was pure chaos. Blackwood, exposed and enraged, pulled his own pistol. He aimed it not at Cale, but at Eliza. If he couldn't have her, no one would. He never fired the shot. An arrow, impossibly fast, flew across the room and buried itself in his gun hand. Blackwood screamed in agony, dropping the pistol. Cale had another arrow knocked. Before anyone could blink, this one aimed directly at Blackwood's heart. At that exact moment, the hotel doors burst open again. This time, it was not one man, but 4 wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. The stable boy had delivered his letter. "Jedediah Blackwood." The lead marshal announced, his voice booming. "You are under arrest for the murder of Arthur Abernathy, by the sworn testimony of Miss Eliza Thompson." The fight was over. Blackwood, clutching his bleeding hand, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred, was taken into custody. Sheriff Thorne was arrested for complicity. It was a swift, stunning victory, won not with a bloody battle, but with courage, truth, and a single perfectly aimed arrow. In the aftermath, Eliza and Cale stood outside on the dusty street as the sun began to set. The townspeople stared at them, a strange and unlikely pair, the Boston lady and the Apache warrior. They were free, but their futures were an unwritten page. "Will you go back?" Kyle asked, his voice low. "To your world?" Eliza looked at the town, at the so-called civilization that had produced a man like Blackwood. Then she looked at Cale, at his quiet strength, at the man who had shown her what it truly meant to be alive. "No," she said, a small smile on her face. "I think my world is out here now." She reached out and took his hand. "But where do we go?" Kyle looked toward the distant mountains, the Sierra Oncha, now bathed in the purple light of twilight. "Home," he said. It was not a place, but a promise. A new beginning forged in fire and blood for the silent warrior and the woman he had sworn to protect. Their pasts were written in scars, but their future for the first time was their own to write. And so the story of Eliza and Kyle doesn't end with a ride into the sunset, but with a walk toward a new dawn. Theirs is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the quietest souls, and the truest freedom lies not in escaping our past, but in facing it head-on. They were 2 people from different worlds, brought together by violence and hatred, but bound forever by courage and a love that bloomed in the harshest of lands. They remind us that even in the most brutal of times, the human spirit in its quest for justice and connection can never truly be broken. If their story of survival, love, and vengeance moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a true Western drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the wild and untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.